Bethpage, Long Island, June 26, 1942. Floodlights glared across a factory floor lined with aluminum frames and rivet guns. The Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation had cleared an entire assembly bay for a new prototype designated XF6F1. The air smelled of oil, aluminum dust, and burnt insulation. Mechanics in blue coveralls worked beneath the wings, fastening inspection panels with pneumatic drills. Every bolt, gauge, and bracket was checked twice. A chalkboard near the nose carried one note: engine installation, pending decision, R2600 or R2800. The Hellcat's shape appeared unremarkable. Straight wings. Thick fuselage. Broad landing gear. Compared to the Japanese A6M0, its lines looked blunt and heavy. The fuselage measured 33 feet 7 inches, nearly a ton heavier than the Navy's previous fighter, the F4F Wildcat. But Chief Engineer William Schwendler had not designed it to win races. He designed it to absorb punishment. At dawn, test pilot Bob Hall climbed into the cockpit. The canopy closed with a metallic click. A Grumman mechanic signaled the ground crew. The Wright R2600-16 engine, an intermediate unit borrowed from the TBF Avenger, coughed to life. Smoke drifted past the hangar doors. The propeller blurred. Fuel pressure steadied at 12 psi. Hall throttled forward. The aircraft rolled down the Bethpage strip and lifted cleanly into the sky at 7:02 a.m. Observers timed its climb to 10,000 feet, 7 minutes 12 seconds. Not impressive. Level speed reached 315 miles per hour, barely above the older Wildcat. Engineers wrote brief notes, then silence. Grumman's founder, Leroy Grumman, stood by the runway edge and watched without expression. According to later internal memoranda, he turned and said only, "Not good enough for the Pacific." By July, reports from naval intelligence described a different standard of performance. Captured flight data from the Zero at NAS Anacostia confirmed its climb rate of 3,100 feet per minute and turning radius under 700 feet. In comparison, the XF6F looked slow and stiff. Yet it carried twice the armor, 212 pounds around the cockpit and oil cooler, and self-sealing fuel tanks the Japanese fighter entirely lacked. Following the first series of flights, Hall noted stability in steep dives and roll recovery beyond expectation. The airframe's weight made it unagile but controllable under high stress. Engineers recorded no structural failures despite repeated 6G pullouts. It was not a fast airplane, it was a forgiving one. In August 1942, the Navy approved installation of the Pratt & Whitney R2800-10 Double Wasp, a 2,000 horsepower radial originally reserved for the Army's P-47 program. Grumman's draftsmen redrew the firewall overnight. The test bench crew worked through the weekend. New engine mounts, cowl flaps, and exhaust stacks were fabricated by hand. When the upgraded XF6F3 took off on July 30th, its climb improved to 3,500 feet per minute, top speed 376 miles per hour. That performance placed it within range of the Zero, but with 4 times the survivability margin. The Navy's acceptance board logged one understated remark: a practical design suitable for carrier service and extended combat. Grumman technicians, veterans of previous crash recoveries, added their own label in chalk on the hangar wall: the Iron Works. By the close of 1942, this slow fighter existed only as an evolving prototype, unpainted, unproven, but ready for mass production. Behind the assembly line's fluorescent hum, engineers began calculating arrestor hook stresses, ammunition feed tolerances, and armor plate patterns. Nothing about the design was elegant. Everything about it was deliberate. The Hellcat was not built to outturn Japan's fastest planes. It was built to survive their first strike and return to fight again. Naval Air Station Anacostia, September 1942. The prototype stood in open sunlight, its fuselage coated in fresh zinc chromate primer. Naval inspectors moved around it with clipboards, measuring pitot angles and wing route access panels. A row of Japanese aircraft, captured in the Pacific and reassembled for testing, sat nearby an A6M20, a Nakajima Ki-43, and fragments of a Mitsubishi bomber. The comparison was deliberate. The U.S. Navy wanted proof, not promises. At 9:15, Commander Frederick Trapnell, one of the Navy's senior test pilots, taxied the Hellcat to the line. 2 engineers from the Bureau of Aeronautics timed every stage. The takeoff run measured 820 feet with a 10-knot headwind. As the aircraft climbed, the double Wasp engine emitted a steady 700 RPM tone. Trapnell noted mild left rudder pressure, stable aileron trim, and minimal vibration through the control column. The landing gear retracted cleanly at 140 knots. At 10,000 feet, he performed a full-power dive to 400 miles per hour indicated, then rolled through an Immelman turn, a maneuver the Zero could never attempt without structural risk. The test notes describe a phrase rarely used in 1942 engineering logs: no tendency toward disintegration. Every surface held firm. Later trials focused on visibility, climb, and armament alignment. 6.50 caliber Browning M2s were mounted with 400 rounds per gun, synchronized for 800-foot convergence. Gun camera footage revealed a tight dispersion pattern, unlike the spread of earlier Wildcats. Trapnell's after-action comment read simply, effective. Predictable. Forgiving install. Grumman's design office received the Anacostia reports by telegraph within hours. In Bethpage, draftsmen adjusted the cowl flap geometry by 12 degrees, trimmed the vertical stabilizer, and replaced the rudder hinge bearings with self-lubricating bronze. Each modification followed a field observation, not a theoretical calculation. The process that autumn became known as combat-backed engineering. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, operational data from Guadalcanal confirmed the Navy's urgency. Wildcat pilots still fought the A6M under disadvantage, slower climb, lower ceiling, lighter guns. The Hellcat's deployment had to close that gap. According to internal memos, Vice Admiral John Towers authorized immediate tooling of production lines even before final testing ended. By November 1942, Grumman's assembly floor produced 15 pre-series F6F3 units. They featured folding wings, armor-glass windshields, and the full double Wasp power plant. Test aircraft number 91271 was flown directly from Bethpage to Norfolk Naval Air Station without incident, 365 miles non-stop, consuming 180 gallons of fuel. The logbook recorded, operational range acceptable for carrier transfer. Carrier simulations followed aboard the USS Charger, CVER-30, in Chesapeake Bay. Landing signal officers filmed each approach with 16mm cameras. The heavy airframe descended at a steady 85 knots, hook engagement on the third wire. No bounce, no propeller strike. Deck crews noted that the wider gear track reduced rollovers compared with earlier fighters. The Hellcat behaved like a machine built to absorb error. By year's end, U.S. Navy maintenance detachments received their first detailed service manuals, 240 pages of diagrams, torque tables, and part codes. Every assembly had been simplified for field replacement, from the hydraulic pumps to the wingfold actuators. A single trained mechanic could remove an engine cowling in under 3 minutes. The plane's appearance remained unglamorous. Painted in sea blue and intermediate blue, it reflected light unevenly, its rivets visible across the skin. Yet flight logs documented consistency rare in 1942. Average mechanical downtime per sortie, 1.2 hours. Average airframe service life, 200 hours, double that of the Wildcat. By early 1943, pilots described the new fighter as ordinary until you needed it most. That remark, noted in the U.S. Naval Air Test Center's December summary, would soon define the aircraft's legacy. Central Pacific, August 1943. The first combat deployment of the F6F Hellcat began aboard the USS Independence and USS Essex, sailing east of the Gilbert Islands. Pilots were briefed on climb rates, dive limits, and fuel endurance. The comparison chart still favored the Japanese Zero in raw agility, but the numbers were beginning to tell another story. The Hellcat's service ceiling reached 37,300 feet, nearly 7,000 higher than its predecessor. Its rate of climb, steady and unhurried, was unmatched in stability. Every performance curve, from torque to manifold pressure, reflected one design intent: reliability under duress. Combat reports from the VF-9 squadron recorded the aircraft's first confirmed engagements. On September 1, Lieutenant Robert Duncan intercepted a formation of Zeros near Marcus Island. He fired a short burst from 6 Brownings at 400 yards. 2 enemy aircraft fell within seconds. His post-flight note read, "No flash, no stall, steady as a rock." The gun cameras confirmed it. From that day, kill-to-loss ratios began to shift dramatically. By the end of 1943, naval intelligence summaries listed 13 Hellcat victories for every loss. Engineers at Grumman reviewed every report that arrived from the Pacific. Bullet trajectories were plotted on diagrams, impact sites circled, and alloy fractures examined. In one recovered fuselage, 72 hits were counted, none of them fatal to the pilot. The self-sealing tank swelled and blackened, the armor behind the cockpit dented but intact. Every puncture became data. From these records, the factory altered production weld seams, added reinforcement to the oil cooler, and reworked hydraulic lines to reduce shrapnel vulnerability. No change was aesthetic. Each modification served a single measurable outcome: pilot survival. Captured Zero wrecks, retrieved from island airstrips and jungles, were tested under U.S. supervision. Their aluminum, an alloy of extra-soft duralumin, crumpled under 20mm impact. No pilot protection existed beyond a thin steel headplate. The intelligence analysts at NAS Anacostia concluded that Japanese airframes were designed for precision, not durability. The Hellcat's philosophy was the opposite. It accepted drag as the cost of life. Flight data showed the paradox in full clarity. At 18,000 feet, the Zero turned tighter. Below 10,000, the Hellcat could dive 120 miles per hour faster. In sustained dives from altitude, the Zero's wings fluttered at 420 miles per hour, while the Hellcat remained controllable past 480 miles per hour. It was not speed that gave the American plane its advantage, but the ability to stay intact at any angle of descent. By late autumn, aerial reconnaissance over Tarawa confirmed operational dominance. Hellcats maintained round-the-clock patrols, escorting dive bombers and torpedo planes through anti-aircraft fire. The aircraft's large fuel capacity and robust engine allowed 2-hour patrols without strain. Radar intercept logs recorded Japanese pilots abandoning combat after brief exchanges, citing the enemy's immunity to damage. Interrogation transcripts from downed pilots later reflected disbelief. They had expected fragile construction, not a fortress in the sky. Back in Bethpage, a letter arrived from a maintenance officer aboard the USS Yorktown. It contained a single sentence: "This aircraft forgives every mistake we make." The line was preserved in the Bureau of Aeronautics' 1944 year-end report as an example of design validation through combat. The data supported it. In its first 6 months of operational service, the Hellcat achieved 4,947 aerial victories against 270 losses. Every sortie strengthened the same conclusion: the Navy's slowest fighter was not built to outfly its enemy. It was built to outlast him. By the close of 1943, the Pacific balance had quietly shifted. The engineers at Grumman, still reading field reports at their drafting tables, understood what the numbers meant before any headline did. Endurance had defeated elegance. By the summer of 1944, the F6F Hellcat had become the Navy's standard-bearer. Its presence marked every major operation from the Marianas to Leyte Gulf. On carrier decks lined with folded wings and refueling hoses, ground crews moved with practiced rhythm. The hum of the double Wasp engine had become the sound of American air power at sea. Combat information centers tracked hundreds of sorties daily. Loss rates, once expected to match those of the Wildcat, had fallen below 5% per mission. The aircraft that began as a heavy, slow alternative had become a statistical anomaly, a fighter that brought its pilots home. Aboard the USS Enterprise, flight officers reviewed performance charts compiled from thousands of sorties. Average combat duration, 52 minutes. Ammunition expended per confirmed kill, 278 rounds. Average climb from deck to interception altitude, for minutes and 20 seconds. Each number told a part of the same quiet story: consistency. The Hellcat was not unpredictable, not fragile, not temperamental. In combat, predictability was life. Japanese pilots noticed the change first. Radio intercepts from the Marianas Turkey Shoot, transcribed by the Office of Naval Intelligence, recorded bewildered voices describing blue planes that do not burn. A Zero pilot identified only as Lieutenant Kawachi reported 3 direct cannon hits on a single enemy fighter without effect. The debriefing from his surviving wingman ended with the phrase, "Our advantage no longer exists." At Grumman's Bethpage plant, this intelligence arrived as a thin folder marked Field Evaluation Number 32. Engineers studied it without commentary. They had long understood that raw maneuverability could not offset structural endurance. In a post-war interview, one of them, Jake Swerble, explained the philosophy plainly: "We built it for the man who had to land it on a moving deck in rain, with holes in his wing." That mindset, expressed without pride, defined the entire production run. Between 1943 and 1945, Grumman produced 12,275 Hellcats, a figure unmatched by any other naval fighter of the war. Assembly lines worked in continuous shifts under mercury lamps, men and women alternating 12-hour rotations. Parts moved from subassembly to fuselage in less than 36 hours. The company's informal motto, "Build it quick, build it strong, build it simple," became doctrine. Out of every 100 aircraft, fewer than 2 failed acceptance testing. The Navy called it industrial reliability, the factory crews called it routine. In the Pacific, that reliability shaped strategy. The Hellcat's endurance allowed deeper patrol arcs, longer escort routes, and more confident carrier operations. Damaged aircraft could limp home on one cylinder, glide onto deck, and be flying again within days. Mechanics patched bullet holes with aluminum sheets and resin, logged each repair, and returned the plane to service. Combat footage showed aircraft landing with shredded flaps, missing panels, even torn stabilizers, always controlled, always landing. By late 1944, the F6F5 variant introduced minor refinements, strengthened canopy framing, improved gun sight, and reinforced tail sections. The changes were subtle, the character remained unchanged. Flight test documents described handling as docile, a word absent from fighter evaluations before that year. The Hellcat was no longer a prototype or a statistic. It had become an instrument of consistency, a machine that delivered victory by repetition rather than spectacle. When the Bureau of Aeronautics compiled its final wartime assessment, the language was spare. The F6F series constitutes a decisive factor in regaining Pacific air superiority. Its design reflects the triumph of durability over maneuver. No ceremony, no celebration, just a technical conclusion drawn from endless records of sorties, recoveries, and return flights. In every sense measurable, that slowest fighter had outsmarted the fastest. Not by outthinking its pilot, nor by outperforming its enemy, but by refusing to fail when failure was expected. Grumman F6F Works, Bethpage, early 1945. Snow drifted against the hangar doors as the production floor lit up for another double shift. The war was still raging across the Pacific, but inside Grumman's plant, the battle was fought in rivet counts, shipping manifests, and tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The Hellcat's creation had become an industrial ritual. Trucks unloaded Pratt & Whitney engines wrapped in waxed paper. Cranes lifted the radial assemblies into fuselage frames. Sparks fell from overhead cranes as welders closed the wing roots. The rhythm of the factory carried the same steadiness as the aircraft it produced. Each section of the plant served a single mechanical function. One wing line, one fuselage line, one test bay. Engineers walked with clipboards, logging vibration data from ground-run engines. Every fourth airframe was powered up, tied to concrete anchors, and throttled to full output for 5 minutes. Mechanics listened for irregular resonance, the auditory inspection replacing expensive instrumentation. They called it the Grumman ear. Production reports show that less than 1% of engines failed the test. In one corner of the plant, a chalkboard listed weekly quotas: 150 completed aircraft, 1,200 sub-assemblies, 4,000 propeller blades. At the peak of wartime demand, a new Hellcat left the line every 63 minutes. Each was tested, flown, and accepted by naval inspectors within the same day. The phrase "Iron Works," once a joke among line workers, had become official shorthand for the company itself. It reflected the character of both machine and method, not elegant, but unbreakable. Naval liaisons rotated through the plant weekly, bringing combat feedback from the fleet. One visiting officer, Commander Tom Hamilton, delivered fragments of battle reports directly to the drafting department. "They're coming back with half the cowlings gone," he told the engineers, laying down a bundle of photographs. "We're learning more from wreckage than from blueprints." Within days, minor reinforcements appeared in the next production batch: thicker armor at the oil cooler, stronger flap hinges, extra rivets at the belly panel. Each adjustment, invisible to the eye, extended life expectancy under fire by measurable margins. Across the Pacific, the aircraft's impact grew visible on map boards. The Hellcat's range and durability enabled Task Force 58 to strike Japan's outer defenses without catastrophic losses. In mission debriefs, pilots described an aircraft that climbed when it should have stalled. Damage control officers noted that recovery rates from ditching incidents had doubled since 1943, thanks to the plane's buoyant structure and sealed compartments. Every operational advantage, from range to repair time, traced back to the design philosophy born on that factory floor. By early 1945, the Hellcat's performance had plateaued not because it was outdated, but because it was sufficient. Pilots trusted it implicitly. Ground crews could disassemble and reassemble its major systems without written instructions. Navy trainers found that even inexperienced aviators adapted quickly, a fact reflected in accident rate statistics that fell by half compared to earlier carrier fighters. The F6F's cockpit layout, designed by a team of engineers who had personally flown the aircraft, became the ergonomic standard for later Navy designs. In post-shift hours, workers gathered near the loading ramps as completed aircraft rolled toward flatbed trucks, their blue paint catching the light from the open hangar doors. Many never saw the ocean, yet every one of them carried the same serial sequence and the same intent. To the people who built it, the Hellcat was no longer just an airplane. It was a pattern of endurance repeated thousands of times, built into metal, tested by fire, and proven by return. From the outside, it remained the slow, broad-winged machine it had always been. But in the records, where numbers spoke louder than design, it had already rewritten the definition of a successful fighter. Western Pacific, March to June 1945. Carrier decks stretched across the sea like moving airfields. From dawn until dusk, waves of Hellcats launched in precise succession, each climb forming part of an aerial grid that covered hundreds of miles. The sound was continuous, the low, even thunder of the double Wasp engine under full manifold pressure. Flight crews worked in heat and salt air, wiping canopies, refueling from drums, reloading belts of ammunition measured by weight instead of count. Every launch and recovery was timed, logged, and filmed. These were not experimental flights anymore. They were production in motion, combat as an industrial process. Over Okinawa, the Hellcat's reputation reached its final test. Kamikaze formations dove through cloud layers at over 350 miles per hour. The interception altitude often left less than 30 seconds of warning. Radar operators aboard the USS Bunker Hill and USS Yorktown guided patrols into converging paths. The F6F could not always catch the dive, but it could climb fast enough to meet it head-on. Gun camera reels from the carrier archive showed tracers converging in front of approaching silhouettes, then vanishing into bursts of flame. Pilots seldom spoke over the radio. The engagement distances were too short for dialogue. In one engagement on April 16, Lieutenant David McCampbell, flying a Hellcat marked Mincy 3, intercepted 9 Japanese aircraft over the East China Sea. He destroyed 7 before returning to the carrier with fuel nearly exhausted. His combat film, later studied by engineers, revealed not extraordinary flying skill but the aircraft's control under maximum stress. Even in high-speed dives, the ailerons responded without compression lag. The R-2800 maintained power through steep climbs without fuel starvation. It was the consistency of a machine that behaved exactly as trained. Ground maintenance logs from Task Force 58 record an average of 14 flight hours per aircraft per day, a utilization rate unmatched in naval aviation to that point. Damage repair crews carried prefabricated panels, replacement flaps, and spare guns to the deck in wooden crates marked by color code. A Hellcat could sustain 2 direct hits and still be flying the same afternoon. The Navy's internal evaluation called this field maintainability, though to the men on deck it meant survival. Pilots of other services began to notice. Army Air Force officers visiting from the Philippines remarked that the Navy's carrier fighter could outperform their land-based designs in both range and climb stability. The comparison was not about glamour or prestige, it was an acknowledgement that the Hellcat had reached a balance between performance and durability that wartime engineers had rarely achieved. It was a weapon system perfected through iteration, not inspiration. Captured Japanese documents from the combined fleet air arm revealed a corresponding shift in tone. Pilots were ordered to avoid direct turning combat with F6Fs at altitudes above 10,000 feet. The memo explained, they do not break apart. They continue to fight even when struck. Those lines, translated and filed under Enemy Technical Appreciation Number 94, summarized the entire conflict in engineering terms. Where Japanese aircraft design valued minimal weight and supreme agility, the Hellcat had demonstrated that survivability was its own form of speed. By June 1945, the war was moving toward its final phase. The skies over the Pacific had changed color, less smoke, more contrails. The Hellcat flew its last massed engagements over the Japanese home islands, escorting bombers that no longer met opposition in numbers. When air superiority reports were filed, the figures were stark. The F6F accounted for 75% of all Navy aerial victories, its kill ratio exceeding 19-1. But in the war rooms, those numbers were treated not as triumphs but as evidence that the system worked exactly as designed. No pilot called it beautiful. Few engineers called it fast. Yet in every measurable way, it had outlasted expectation. Its strength lay not in design perfection but in resistance, to weather, to error, to the chaos of combat. On the ocean that never stayed still, the Hellcat remained steady. Okinawa to Tokyo Bay, August 1945. The war's final months revealed the last truth about the F6F Hellcat, that endurance was not simply a mechanical trait, but a pattern of survival. On carrier decks stained with oil and cordite, the aircraft returned from missions with flak holes stitched across their wings, engine cowlings blackened, and canopy glass cracked from near misses. Ground crews counted the damage, patched it, and signed the aircraft back into flight within hours. Reports from USS Bunker Hill showed aircraft 32 F-14 flying 12 missions in 7 days, despite taking damage on 4 separate occasions. It was not heroism. It was a process refined to routine. Pilots who flew the Hellcat near the end of the Pacific campaign described the same paradox: it never felt fast, but it always brought them home. Lieutenant Alexander Vrashu called it the kind of plane you stop noticing. His combat record, 19 victories, reflected both skill and trust. Every maneuver had predictable resistance, every stall a familiar recovery. In the chaos of dogfights over the Philippine Sea, predictability was more valuable than elegance. The Bureau of Aeronautics Performance Analysis Division gathered post-war data through 1945. Their final tables showed the pattern with mathematical clarity: 12,275 built, 270 lost to enemy action, 4,947 kills credited in its first year of service alone. Reliability measured in flight hours per maintenance hour exceeded any wartime standard, 0.92, compared with 0.56 for the Corsair and 0.41 for the Wildcat. Each statistic confirmed what pilots already knew intuitively: the Hellcat was not a thoroughbred, but a workhorse engineered to survive conditions no calculation could predict. Japanese after-action evaluations echoed the same conclusion from the opposite side. Intelligence documents recovered from Yokosuka Naval Arsenal included a technical appreciation dated May 1945. Enemy carrier fighter shows no structural weakness in dive or roll. Pilot protection superior. Machine appears overbuilt but cannot be defeated by conventional means. The phrase overbuilt appeared underlined 3 times. To the Japanese engineers who prized minimal mass, the idea of designing for damage absorption rather than avoidance was incomprehensible. Yet it had won the war in the air. By August, as carriers approached Japanese waters, the Hellcat's role began to fade quietly. It still flew escort and patrol missions, but the sky was emptying. There were no formations to intercept, no dogfights to record. Photographs from the USS Essex show rows of Hellcats chained to the deck, wings folded, engines silent, salt mist gathering on their canopies. The noise that had once defined the Pacific was gone. Only maintenance crews remained, cleaning tools and writing up last inspections before decommissioning orders. In the final Navy technical bulletin issued before Japan's surrender, the F6F was described without rhetoric: aircraft demonstrated satisfactory performance under all operational environments. Primary contribution: air superiority and fleet defense. That understatement captured the machine's entire story. There were no superlatives, no emotional language, only the measured voice of engineers summarizing proof. When the war ended on September 2, 1945, the Hellcats lined the carrier decks as silent witnesses. Many of their pilots watched from the railings as the Japanese delegation signed the surrender aboard the USS Missouri. They did not salute or celebrate. They stood quietly beside aircraft that had done their work without drama. The F6F would soon be replaced by jets, its airframes scrapped or sold for parts, but its influence remained embedded in every future naval design: thick skins, wide gear, armored cockpits, accessible maintenance. The lessons it carried were not about speed, but about endurance. The Hellcat had proven that in war, survival could be engineered, not hoped for, not guessed at, but built into metal and rivet. Naval Air Test Center, Patuxent River, 1946. Winter air rolled across the Maryland coast as the hangar doors opened on a row of silent aircraft. Among them stood a single F6F-5, its blue paint dulled by salt and age, logbook marked with more than 800 flight hours. Engineers moved around it without ceremony. They measured metal fatigue along the spar joints, tested the hydraulic seals, and logged the hours flown since overhaul. Every line on the inspection sheet told the same quiet conclusion: the machine had outlasted its war. Technicians removed the cowling to examine the double wasp engine. Carbon traces lined the exhaust, bearings still within tolerance. One report noted, all systems serviceable. No abnormal wear after total hours exceeding design limit. To the Bureau of Aeronautics, this was data. To those who had worked through the nights at Bethpage, it was validation. The Hellcat's design had not merely survived combat, it had transcended it. In an adjoining office, analysts compiled the final statistical summaries for Navy archives. Kill-to-loss ratio, 19:1. Total aerial victories, 5,163. Average pilot survival rate per engagement, over 97%. The numbers were typed cleanly, aligned by decimal points, without commentary. One margin note in pencil read simply, operational ideal achieved. The same year, comparative studies began for post-war aircraft development. The Navy's emerging jet program sought higher speeds and thinner airframes, yet the engineers used the Hellcat as a baseline for survivability. They measured ejection seat load factors, armor distributions, and cockpit visibility angles against its geometry. Even in obsolescence, the F6F remained a reference for what endurance meant. In Britain, former Royal Navy pilots who had flown Lend-Lease Hellcats during the Eastern Fleet operations filed their closing assessments. Lieutenant Commander R.J. Cork, in his final report to the Admiralty, wrote, "It lacks grace but inspires absolute trust. The machine and man are of one rhythm." His phrasing captured what engineering tables could not quantify: the absence of fear in flight. At Grumman, production had already shifted to peacetime contracts, but one corner of the plant retained a section of the Hellcat line. Workers dismantled jigs and fixtures, preserving a few as museum donations. The rest went to scrap. A supervisor noted that the noise of cutting torches sounded almost like the engine starting one last time. By the end of that year, the company's official chronicle listed 12,275 units completed, a number that represented not an era of speed, but of faith in function. In the decades that followed, historians often compared the Hellcat to its contemporaries, the Spitfire, the Mustang, the Zero. They measured climb rates, top speeds, wing loadings. The figures favored others in elegance and performance, yet none matched its survival curve. It was the aircraft that treated combat as a repeatable operation, not an act of chance. When the U.S. Navy declassified its 1946 engineering review, one paragraph stood apart from the calculations. The F6F established a standard of structural integrity and pilot protection that defines the threshold of acceptable combat design. Its contribution cannot be measured in victories alone, but in lives returned. In that line, the purpose of the slowest fighter found its final meaning. It had proven that endurance could be designed as deliberately as speed, and that survival itself could become a weapon. On every deck where its wings once folded, and in every logbook that recorded its flights, the pattern remained unchanged: take off, fight, return. No slogans were attached to its story, no speeches made in its honor. The F6F Hellcat simply endured, and through endurance, it defined victory.